Hi, I'm Dave, founder of Halloween Year Round, and today I'm talking about the career of one Ty West, a filmmaker that most general audiences have really only been familiar with for the last 2 years with the X, Pearl, and now Maxxine trilogy, but who's been directing movies for almost 20 years. He's originally from Wilmington, Delaware, which is kind of cool because I grew up in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. So Wilmington was like one county over, and I've been there a million times. So I feel like Ty West and I probably have been to a lot of the same places growing up, just in that area. So with the release of Maxine and the completion of his trilogy, I wanted to go back and look at not just his trilogy, but his filmography as a whole. This whole video originally started out as I was going to do it like X versus Pearl versus Maxine. And then I kind of wanted to expand it to the rest of his movies because this is a director that I personally have been a fan of for almost 15 years, ever since I saw House of the Devil for the first time, long before anybody really knew who Ty West was. So, with this video, I'm doing a top 5 Ty West movies. Why a top 5? Well, I thought about just ranking them all outright. There's about 10 of them, depending on whether you count like super early indie slash student films or whether you count TV episodes he's directed, the number's a lot higher. I decided to go with top 5 because I wanted it to be more than just a ranking of his recent trilogy. I wanted to be able to focus on some of his other movies, but I also felt that it wasn't really fair to like rank, a very early, very micro budget movie he did when he was still up and coming against like X or Pearl. I didn't think it was really fair to to put them against each other. I also think like with Cabin Fever 2, that's a movie that he disowned. He tried to get his name taken off it and they wouldn't. But he says that, that's not the movie he directed. And again, I don't think it's fair, given those facts, to even include that in this list or ranking. So that's why I'm going with a top 5. Honorable mentions: In the Valley of Violence and The Innkeepers. So let's start with In the Valley of Violence. Really, really solid Western movie, and one that almost feels like the outlier in his filmography, in that they're like all horror, thriller, at least horror adjacent. And then you just have like this really, really good character driven Western with Ethan Hawke and John Travolta that if I was more of a Western fan, this one probably would have ranked higher. But again, I felt weird even comparing it to something like, X or Pearl or The Sacrament or something like that. So that's why it wound up as an honorable mention. And then, of course, The Innkeepers, a very, very solid supernatural, haunted hotel movie that kind of has vibes of what would later be the Hell House series. Really love Pat Healy in it, really love Sarah Paxton. It's effective and it's creepy. The only reason that it didn't quite make the list was it's not that I don't like it, because I really do. The other movies on the list just kind of got to me a little bit more than that one did. So now that those are out of the way, we can get started. Number 5, The Sacrament. I have gone on record to say that I am not a big fan of found footage movies. It's probably my least favorite subgenre of horror. That being said, I love As Above, So Below, and I think The Sacrament uses its found footage aesthetic in a really creative way through the guise of, this is a Vice documentary about this cult. For anyone who's, of course, familiar with, Jim Jones and the People's Temple, that awful, awful, tragic real life story. That's basically what this movie is. It's fictional. They're fictional characters. I feel like that was just Ty West's way of doing the Jim Jones story, but not making it feel as exploitative as it would have been had it just been Jim Jones and use like the real names and real locations of everything. By making it, fictional, you kind of remove it just enough that you can take creative liberties where you want without disrespecting the real life tragedy that happened. But it's because of that real life tragedy that I think makes The Sacrament all the more disturbing. Yes, it suffers from found footage itis, where, they're really struggling to find reasons to keep the camera rolling, and you have characters like running for their lives, and it's like, Would you really still be running the camera right now? There's someone about to kill you. You're really going to worry about the camera right now? Where even like the cult leader's like, I want you to film all this. Nothing you've done up to this point makes anyone believe that you actually want the world to see any of this. He's very secretive. That being said, the cult leader himself, father, really creepy performance that I think, in a weird way, The Sacrament makes for a good pairing piece with Kevin Smith's Red State. I think they would make for a really good, like, religious fanaticism double feature. And knowing what we know about Maxxxine, which I'm not going to spoil here, The Sacrament, in a weird way, kind of holds the key to understanding Maxxxine. I was watching Maxxxine, and I got to a certain part, and if you know, you know. I'm like, this is the sacrament. This is like he's taking the sacrament, and he put that idea in his pocket, and he's like, I'm gonna reuse this later. And it kind of all plays out in Maxine. But it was knowing that real life story that made watching all these people, very reluctantly drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, just really disturbing and really upsetting. And it struck me. It struck me in a way that I rewatched this movie for the list. I'd watched it for the first time many years ago, right around the time it first came out, and it affected me more now. And I walked away from it like I'm still thinking about it. It's still messing with my head. Number 4, Maxine. Look, every third installment of a trilogy has the hardest job of any movie in it. It has to, satisfy the audience. It has to tell a story, but it also has to give an ending that's not just an ending for that movie, but that feels like a satisfying ending for that whole trilogy. Do I think Maxine succeeds at that? Not really. It is an incredibly fun, stylish, like, just oozing in 80s and giallo and seedy Hollywood vibes. Its cast is amazing. You got Kevin Bacon, you got Giancarlo Esposito, you got Lily Collins, you got Elizabeth Debicki, you've got Mia Goth. There's so much working for it. The ingredients are all there. It just wasn't marinated the right way story-wise to be higher on the list, and as a result, I think it's the weakest of the trilogy. That does not mean I don't like this movie. I love every movie I'm talking about here today. I just think that, again, try not to spoil it. I have a spoiler review up. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check that out and hear my, like, really unfiltered thoughts on Maxine. I just think that plot-wise, not everything adds up, and the Ty West got to the point that he wasn't sure how to end it, and he just went with this idea over here, even though this idea over here doesn't really make sense or mesh well with everything else the trilogy had done over here. But it is probably the most stylish and probably the most rewatchable of all the X Pearl and Maxine trilogy. But just because it's rewatchable doesn't mean it's the best. Revenge of the Sith, I would argue, is probably the most rewatchable Star Wars movie, but it's no Empire Strikes Back. Number 3, X. I remember the first time I saw this in theaters just thinking, like, they don't make movies like this anymore. A B movie with A ideas that's meta to the point that, like, as RJ is describing, it's possible to make a good dirty movie. A movie that pulls off the genre shift almost as well as something like From Dusk Till Dawn, where the whole first half is this, like, seedy, like, adult movie they're making, and then it turns into a slasher. It goes from Boogie Nights to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yes, it wears its influences on its sleeve, but it uses them really well, and it was so much more than just a slasher. It was this really kind of thoughtful and fascinating study on aging and our fear of aging, and how we discard someone like Pearl and Howard, especially Pearl, for her being a woman, oh, she's not desirable anymore, she has no value. And the way she looks at Maxine and Bobby, like, I want what they have. I regret not doing more when I was young. There's so much more to this than just a slasher. But then when it's being a slasher, It's a really good slasher. The kills are really creative. They're eye-popping. Um, it subverts your expectations. It sets up one character that you think is going to be the final girl, but she's not, and it kind of subverts that in a really blasting way, if you know what I mean, if you've seen it. And it just does so much more than it should have. There's a indie slashers are a dime a dozen. I know it's not indie, it was A24. Low budget slashers are a dime a dozen, but none of them make you think as much as X does. And the only reason why Pearl beats it, it's close, it's very close, is because I think Pearl does a little bit more with its characters. X has a great ensemble cast that does get topped a little bit with Maxxxine just in the amount and variety of people. But again, I love how it subverts the expectations that these are actual likable characters that normally you would expect, a bunch of people making a porn film who get murdered. We're supposed to hate them. They're supposed to be like dirty, nasty. They're really nice people that all have this dream. And it's like who doesn't relate to that? Granted, we haven't all made a porn film. Some of us have. We haven't all been murdered. Some of us have. But we've all had a dream, haven't we? Number 2, Pearl. I told you that X and Pearl were very close. And the reason why Pearl edges it out just a little bit, it's the character study. It's Mia Goth's performance. Yes, Pearl is probably the slowest paced of the whole trilogy. Yes, I can understand someone, maybe you don't have the longest attention span, maybe, just slow burns aren't your thing. I can understand you taking issue with that. But if you stick around for it, if you stick around for the ride, you eat your vegetables, you get your dessert at the end. The dessert is that 8-minute long monologue that is done almost in one entire shot that, Mia Goth just memorized that speech. That is heart-wrenching. That makes X all the more tragic to go back and watch it, knowing Pearl's past. It's such a fascinating character study on someone who is going down the path of becoming like a psycho killer. Like she's gonna be an Annie Wilkes, she's gonna be a Lizzie Borden, but all she wanted to be was a Disney princess at the beginning. She just wanted to be a star. And there's this sense of again with the theme of the American dream. There's the sense and this clash of ideas between Pearl. I want my life to be the way I want it to be, and her mom, your life, you should just appreciate what you have and be grateful that you even have a life. You know, we're living in uncertain times. We're living in, financial crisis after financial crisis, housing crisis. And it's like, I get that. I get as a child, as a millennial child in the 90s who grew up on the idea of like things are always going to get better and then they didn't. I get that clash between Pearl and her mom, and I don't fault either one of them for having their opinions that they do, and I can understand why they each feel that way. Granted, it doesn't give Pearl, justification to murder everyone, but you can see how someone in that scenario could have been driven to that and push past her breaking point. It is a career defining performance for Mia Goth. She should have been nominated for an Oscar for that monologue scene alone. And it's the movie that I go back to that scene over and over again, and I'm like, I want to teach an acting class with this scene, with this movie. It's the one that I think, whether or not Ty West intended to, I know that like doing Pearl was kind of just a random idea. Hey, let's do this prequel too. And I think he accidentally made one of the best movies of his career. I say one of because we still need to get to number 1. And finally, number 1, House of the Devil. I did not intend for this list to like be bookends and then the trilogy sandwiched in between. It just kind of worked out that way. I will say I knew from the start this was always going to be number 1. Now, Ty West has done, you look at his filmography, a lot of these movies are randomly period pieces. Pearl is set in 1918, X is set in 1979, Maxxxine is set in 1985, and House of the Devil, like those, is set in the early 1980s. I want to say like 81 or 83, if I remember correctly. But the thing that House of the Devil does that those movies don't, not only does it tap into the satanic panic of the 1980s, not only does it give us a really cool, like, cult horror movie, not cult as in like cult status, but like a literal, satanic cult doing a ritual, but it almost convinces you that it was made in the early 1980s. It's shot on 16 millimeter film. Even the editing, the takes are longer. There's fewer cuts in scenes because that's how they edited movies back then. The music, even the title card at the beginning is all in the same style as they would have done. It's paced like a movie from the early 80s. And it feels like it's doing that nostalgia right, not in a way that's like throwing references left and right, like it's, that 90s show or Stranger Things. It's just existing in that time period. And there's so much else going on. You have such a creepy performance from Tom Noonan. The second Jocelyn Donahue walks into that house, it's so tense. What other low budget horror movie features the director of a Best Picture nominee that grossed $1 billion getting murdered on screen? I don't see James Cameron being in an early slasher movie getting killed on screen. He should, that'd be cool. But there's just, when I look back at like a movie that just makes me feel that era, a movie that captures the nostalgia right, and a movie that almost tricks me into thinking it's from it, it's House of the Devil. There's nothing else quite like it. The Love Witch comes close to tricking you into thinking it's from the 60s, but nothing can top House of the Devil. It's been my favorite movie ever since I saw it, and even after, the newer trilogy, it's still my favorite. But hey, these are just my thoughts. I would love to know, what are your favorite Ty West movies? What's your order tier ranking of X, Pearl, and Maxxxine? Please leave a comment below. I'd love to see it. Like, share, subscribe, all the YouTube stuff. If you don't, you may end up being targeted by, a satanic cult like House of the Devil, or Pearl herself, or the weird cult in the Sacrament. And as always, every day is Halloween.